China says it is committed to a peaceful rise in its military power. This even as the United States rebalances significant military assets to the Asia-Pacific region. I'm joined now by Christopher Young. He is the Donald Bren Chair of Non-Western Strategic Thought at the Marine Corps University. So let's talk about this dichotomy. You know, we have the U.S. Ships sailing near islands. China, we have Chinese ships sailing off to the east coast of Jacksonville. It seems like one seems kind of provocative, the other seems like friendly. How do we square these two?
Well, definitely the Chinese visit to Mayport is a friendly visit. It's a goodwill visit, no question about that. Now, I would point out that the U.S. Navy ships have pulled into Chinese ports on friendship visits as well. So I wouldn't necessarily create that dichotomy of a Chinese visit to Florida as friendly and U.S. ships sailing within 12 nautical miles of the Chinese islands, Chinese declared islands, as provocative. A little bit of context. The Chinese have been reclaiming islands in the South China Sea, which the U.S. has declared is somewhat provocative. And so the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. government has been declaring that, almost telegraphing its punch, saying we believe in freedom of navigation, and therefore we're going to likely over the next year or so sail a ship within this area. And so I think the United States is just trying to send a message to China that it sees freedom of navigation as an important interest of the United States, and therefore a freedom of navigation operation is an instrument to do that. So I don't know if I would necessarily. That's an interesting way of juxtaposing it, a friendly visit to Florida versus a Navy ship.
But China does see it as an incursion. That's how they view it.
There's no question that's how they see it, yeah.
And they feel as though this should be worked out by the parties in the area, and perhaps the U.S. shouldn't meddle. That's how they view it.
That's correct, yeah. I would say that's an accurate description of how the Chinese view the issue, and the Chinese have come out and said this is an unnecessary provocation. But again, the United States has said, listen, freedom of navigation is important to us, just as the protection of your maritime sovereignty rights is important to you. And so the two countries, again, trying to work out amongst each other their national interests.
Well, talk to me about that, because you've got your public pronouncements. What's going on behind the scenes?
Sure,
how do you think the conversations are going?
That's a very good question, because if asked, how do you think military-to-military relations are going? How do you think the bilateral relations are going? I'd say they're actually going pretty well. That is, over the last 4 years, the number of contacts between the militaries has increased. I think a good indicator is the fact that right after the destroyer sailed within 12 nautical miles of Chinese declared territory, what happened only a few days later, or shortly thereafter, the commander, Pacific Command, was in Beijing, describing what his perspective on it. So I think that's a real indicator of how relations are going. It's not behind the scenes. I think that the two sides are working out amongst each other, but the two militaries are definitely signaling to one another, signaling resolve, both to each other and to the region as a whole.
Let me talk a little bit about a book that you co-edited a few years back, and I want to read a bit from it. All rising powers with rising navies have eventually collided with other great naval powers in combat, sometimes with other rising powers and sometimes with powers that had achieved supremacy. Continues, countries with significant naval power can always be tempted to use it. Yet history also shows that rising naval power need not mean rising chances of war. Balancing this, how do you go about it?
I think the way I would characterize what was written there is to say that when two naval powers meet, there's always, when you've got an established power that's a naval power and a rising power that is catching up to it, there's always a good likelihood or a chance that the two will clash. It's not inevitable that the two clash. There are a couple of elements that lead to the ability of the two countries to work out with one another. Transparency. Are both countries being transparent with one another? Are the two countries treating each other with respect? Are the two countries recognizing the interests of the other? And so there are elements and interests that the two countries will recognize so that they can work out with one another. There are formulas for the two countries to resolve issues with each other. And actually the Chinese have a phrase for that. It's a new type of major power relationship, exactly. And a component of it is a new type of military-to-military relationship. So the Chinese have looked at this and said, we need not necessarily conflict with one another. Let's sit down and let's think about this. So Chinese and American scholars are constantly talking about that issue. Is it inevitable that the two countries necessarily collide and clash with one another? I don't think so. I don't think it's inevitable. but analyzing it and figuring out the formulas or the ways to work with one another, that's what's key.
And you and I talked about RIMPAC, the China being involved in it this last year. The visit to Mayport, so, you know, as you said, the dialogue that continues. Talk to me, because I guess people look at it and they say, well, can these two work together, or will it be adversarial? You know, what are some of the signals you look for?
The signals that I look for, well, a visit like the three-ship Chinese visit to Mayport are important visits. They're important, show signs of goodwill. But what I particularly look for are areas where the two countries can cooperate in real-world operations, in exercises. And so, for example, the fact that China and the United States have cooperated on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief exercises, the fact that in strategic dialogue discussions between the Chinese military and the U.S. military, proposals like perhaps we can get together and talk about cooperation for non-combatant evacuation operations. For example, the NEO operation that the Chinese did in Libya and the one they did in Yemen. The United States has a great deal of experience doing that type of operation. The Chinese are interested in learning how to do that type of peaceful operation, and the U.S. military and the Department of Defense have discussed those kinds of issues with the Chinese. So I look for concrete examples where the two sides can work with one another and actually develop cooperative mechanisms with one another. I look at crisis mechanisms that the two sides can work with one another. So the recent agreement signed between China and the United States on unexpected encounters at sea, notifications to one another of military exercises and activities in certain regions of the world. Those are the types of things I look for to see the two sides cooperating and working with one another. And I'm seeing that. I'm seeing evidence of that.
So you're seeing good signs of it?
Yeah, I am seeing good signs of it. Now, at the same time, I am also seeing signaling to one another and resolve. And so it's a complex relationship between the two, but I'm not a pessimist. I sort of see the two sides attempting to work with one another and, again, signaling to one another, but behind the scenes, continuing to see high-level visits to each other's country. Again, Admiral Harris, Commander Pacific Command, visiting Beijing only very shortly after the destroyer sailing in the South China Sea. Yeah. So to me, that's a good sign.
All right. Christopher, thanks so much for coming in and offering your analysis.